the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. On this summer Friday, most of the show today will be an encore presentation of our recent special on ultra-processed foods. We'll also re-air a really interesting and for some people inspiring conversation that we had recently with Amherst professor and publisher Ilan Stavins. He's got an anthology of Americans who have written and spoken about their religious thinking from colonial times to the present. But first, ultra-processed foods, our topic this year for an annual health convening that we do on the show with support from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation as an opportunity for healthcare experts and practitioners to inform WNYC's health reporting and inform you all as listeners. Let's pick it up here. Today, our health convening takes on ultra-processed foods. What's the actual science about what makes a food ultra-processed? What health risks are actually associated with different kinds? One interesting finding from a researcher who will join us a little later is there seems to be a big gender difference in the colorectal cancer risk from a certain category of ultra-processed food. She'll explain why women seem more susceptible and what that category of foods is. And we'll have former FDA Commissioner David Kessler, who's proposing specific new ways to regulate them, and get his take on whether RFK Jr. just talks tough on ultra-processed food corporations or is actually doing anything as Health and Human Services Secretary. But we start with some of the basic science of ultra-processed foods with a leading expert in the field, Dr. Kevin Hall, former senior investigator at the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, a health and diet expert who had done some seminal research in ultra-processed foods and disease. He also, by the way, took early retirement from the NIH last year at age 54 because he said the RFK Jr. administration was censoring him. We'll get into some of that, but more of the science. Dr. Hall, thanks for coming on. Welcome to WNYC.
Thanks for having me.
I think we should start with a definition. What are ultra-processed foods? How do you use the term?
Right. Well, it's actually a topic that's fraught with a lot of debate right now, and it's a real question about whether or not some of the debate is really trying to prolong the discussion so that the food industry can skirt by with kind of having these some of the unhealthy foods on the market, or whether there's real scientific debate about this topic. The vast majority of studies have used something called the NOVA categorization system, which was developed by Carlos Montero's team in Brazil. It basically decides to group foods into 4 different categories. A sort of minimally processed food category is group 1. That's the typical sort of fruits and vegetables and fresh meat and eggs and things like that you would typically think of as quote unquote real foods. There's a second category, category 2, which is processed culinary ingredients. Those are the things that you typically don't eat on your own. That's like the table sugar and cooking oils and things like that. Then there's category 3, which is basically combinations of category 1 and category 2 foods as you would kind of typically prepare them in a home kitchen. And then there's the 4th category, which is labeled ultra-processed foods. And it could be, a category by exclusion. If it's not one of the first 3 categories, it belongs there, but it also has its own definition and basically is operationalized by ingredients or processes that are typically not used in home kitchens or restaurants. So the kinds of additives and flavorants and cosmetic things that are and preservatives that are sometimes added to packaged foods that prolong their shelf life and also lead to potentially some negative health consequences.
So would you describe the landmark study that you conducted in 2019, described by the NIH at the time as the first randomized controlled trial on the topic? I see that it was small, just 20 healthy subjects and short term, just 1 month. But tell us about that study. How did you group the participants? What did they eat? And what do you think you may have established?
Yeah, sure. So it was a very small sort of mechanistic study to try to understand, is there something about ultra-processed foods per se that might be driving excess calorie intake, which is kind of on the pathway to weight gain and obesity. And what we did was we designed 2 sets of diets where the nutrients were matched between them. Not all the nutrients, but the typical players: the calories, the carbs, the fat, the protein, the sugar, the fiber, those kinds of things that we often think of as either health promoting or health deteriorating. These were matched between two sort of diets that we had our cooks and our dietitians design. But in one case, all those foods came, or 80% of the calories came from ultra processed foods, that category 4 foods that we talked about in the NOVA system. And in the other case, 80% of calories came from minimally processed foods, category 1. And no ultra processed foods. And we basically had people come to live with us in our research center at the NIH, took complete control over their environments, and for 1 month continuously they spent with us, and we either gave them for the first 2 weeks the ultra processed diet, followed by the minimally processed diet, or the reverse. And so the same people acted as their own controls. And what we didn't tell them was that we would be measuring their leftovers, so that we could figure out exactly, we knew exactly what we presented to these people, and we could measure every morsel of food that they ate over the course of each 2-week period to figure out whether or not they were eating more or less calories on the ultra processed diet or the minimally processed diet, despite being matched for the presented calories and many of these nutrients of concern. And we measured a variety of things during this process, including how much body fat changed and things like that. But the really striking result was that despite people not reporting any differences in fullness or appetite or desire to eat, and not reporting any differences in the pleasantness of the meals, they ended up eating on average about 500 calories per day more during the ultra-processed food environment exposure than they did during the minimally processed food environment exposure. They were spontaneously gaining weight and gaining fat when they were on the ultra-processed diet, and spontaneously losing weight and losing fat on the minimally processed diet. This is despite telling them not to be trying to, gain or lose weight on the study. In fact, they were blinded to their weight measurements. They were wearing loose-fitting clothing, so they couldn't tell if it was getting tighter or looser over the course of the experiment. So this was the first kind of causal experiment that was, on top of a wide range of previous observational studies that had linked diets high in ultra-processed foods with increased risk for obesity and various other downstream metabolic consequences.
Because the risk you were able to isolate was overeating, which leads to obesity, which is associated with diabetes and heart disease and other chronic conditions, correct?
That's correct, yes. And of course, we don't know exactly what it was about the ultra-processed foods in this diet. It wasn't that they were more heavily advertised or anything like that, or harder to kind of obtain, because basically all the food was presented to these people in the same way, and they didn't have to work for it or cook it or any of these sorts of things that are also part of the issue with making ultra-processed foods much more easily available to people.
Yeah, but that leads to another question I had after reading your study. Categorizing foods as highly processed seems so general, right? Like your study gave examples of ingredients in ultra-processed foods like hydrogenated oils, high fructose corn syrup, emulsifiers, flavoring agents. I assume that means artificial flavors. But my question is, has science isolated certain ingredients from that list as culprits? Maybe the health effects of certain emulsifiers or certain food dyes or flavoring agents are carcinogenic, some are not. And the category of ultra-processed foods sounds categorically evil or unhealthy, but it's really specific things that people should avoid and can still have some of these other treats. But you tell me.
Yeah, no, I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing. I happen to be in the camp that thinks that there's probably ultra-processed foods that can be healthy for you. A whole group that could potentially be neutral for health, and then there's the bad guys that are probably unhealthy for you. The challenge is that we don't know how to identify those right now. We need better science to be able to identify what are the key culprits. We were doing some of that science at the NIH. So, for example, we finished a study recently and presented at a conference. It's not yet published in a peer-reviewed paper, where we designed a diet that still had 80% of ultra-processed foods, but in contrast to our previous study, we re-engineered that diet in such a way that people did not overeat calories. In fact, they lost the same amount of of weight as the same people when they were on a minimally processed diet without ultra processed foods. So you could still eat an 80% ultra processed diet as long as it's defined in the right way and not result in overeating. And it's that kind of science that we need to better identify what are the true culprits, what are the real problematic either ingredients or properties of the foods themselves, and then be able to kind of tell consumers as well as the food industry as well as regulators how to target their lens to better improve our food environment.
I'm sure you just piqued the interest of a lot of listeners who are saying, "Oh, tell me what 80% ultra processed food diet would keep me as healthy as one that isn't that."
Well, I don't know about healthy. We were looking at is very specifically whether or not we could mitigate the overeating aspect. Right now,
I
there's
see.
all sorts of other health consequences, and I think you'll have a discussion with folks later about maybe specific ingredients like emulsifiers and how they might impact the gut microbiome and might impact
Yes.
inflammation and things like that. We are exploring those kinds of outcomes, but the study was mainly designed to address the question of overeating and mitigation of
Got
weight
it.
gain and obesity.
On what foods count? I see your NIH article at the time gave examples that included something that might surprise some people, a bagel with cream cheese and bacon. Now, a bagel with cream cheese might not be the first thing that comes to people's minds as opposed to, chips and cookies and
Right.
packaged meat products and things like those. So, bagel with cream cheese?
Yeah, so it contained ingredients that would categorize it as in that Nova 4 category. And now, if I think that's part of the challenges of the definition is, well, what about, a freshly baked bagel that doesn't contain some of those things and therefore doesn't have the same sort of shelf life? Is that any better or worse for you than the cheaper long shelf life version that you might buy in a supermarket, for example? And these are the kinds of debates that folks in nutrition science are having, especially when the nutrient profile of those two products looks quite similar.
Let's take a phone call. Here's Janet in Crown Heights. Janet, you're on WNYC with Dr. Kevin Hall. Hey there.
Good morning. I would like to know, do you think that the ultra-processed food producers are trying to make the food taste so delicious so that we will buy it, overeat it, and then come back to eat it again? Because it seems like a lot of this food is like if we wouldn't eat it if we actually saw what it looked like, but so they have to make it taste good and last
Yeah,
long and be easy to cook.
that's a great question, and I think it could land on, well, you found that people who were eating the ultra processed foods diet ate more. I'm thinking of the old Lay's potato chips commercial where the slogan was, "I'll bet you can't eat just one." But do you think that the food industry, the processed food industry, is designing these things not just to be tasty, but so that you will keep eating?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And by the way, those Lay's potato chips that were marketed that way, they actually don't qualify as ultra processed foods. They qualify as
Oh,
processed foods, category 3, which is quite interesting. But
wait, what's the difference? People would be interested in that. Why not?
yeah, so it doesn't contain many of the same sort of additives and preservatives that are in other sorts of potato chips and Doritos and the artificial flavors and colors and things like that. So I think to my recollection, those Lay's potato chips are basically just potatoes. They're cooking oil and salt is basically all that's in them. So they only
Okay.
qualify as category 3 foods. Um, so this is where some of the debate comes from, right? Not all ultra processed foods are necessarily bad for you, and certainly many processed and minimally processed foods can be bad for you, especially when taken in context of the overall dietary pattern. But to address the specific question that the caller asked about, which is, do food companies design foods to be desired to go back for more? Of course they do, right? They want to be profitable businesses that have repeat customers, and they basically have designed these focus groups of people to kind of comment on the properties of their foods, how delicious they are, how much they'd pay for them, And they actually have, in some sense, it's like evolution in the marketplace, right? You have the survival of the fittest. They have their best ideas about what products are going to be successful, and if they succeed, great. And if they fail, then they've learned something from that, and they will re-engineer a new set of products that will be successful in the marketplace. So we actually have like this evolution of the most tasty, the most accessible products. Now the question is whether or not they want us or have engineered the products to have poor health outcomes and to be overeaten to cause obesity and other downstream metabolic complications. I have my questions about that because I think, soda manufacturers, for example, are perfectly willing to sell you a diet soda as they are a full calorie soda, and they will make as much or potentially more profits from the diet version. I don't work for food companies. I don't have any insight into their thinking on these processes, but it strikes me as something that is worthy of investigation.
Scott in Brooklyn has a personal anecdote to share. Scott, you're on WNYC.
Hey guys, I'm feeling a little guilty and also this is funny at the same time, or maybe sad. But I've been on a GLP-1 for over a year. I've dropped about almost 50 pounds. And a couple months ago, I used to have a addiction to like sugary cereals, like Frosted Flakes and Trix and all that stuff. And I do know it's bad for me, but I have to tell you, I went to the store and they were on sale, and I kind of re-upped my addiction to them, even while I'm still taking these GLP-1s, and I kind of barely eat. It's really reduced my appetite, but just eating like a bowl full of cereal twice a day, it has flatlined my weight loss. And I find that really interesting. I'm curious as to why that
Flatlined your weight loss. In other words, the weight loss that you would have otherwise been continuing on the GLP-1, that isn't increasing. Yeah. So, well, that's interesting. That might be consistent with the finding about certain ingredients, even though he's not stuffing himself with big quantities, Dr. Hall.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's actually the topic of what I'm most interested in these days, which is how does these changes in our food environment, in particular ultra-processed foods, and the mechanisms by which they actually seem to alter the biological control of appetite. These studies are done so that people, we think that, people regulate their body weight. They have some sort of control over appetite based on this internal symphony of metabolic and hormonal signals that we've learned so much about over the past many decades. And somehow placing the same people with the same biology in these different food environments, that can be shifted by many hundreds of calories per day. And we now know that these newer generations of obesity medications are also influencing the biological control of appetite. And this interaction between this next generation of obesity medications and how our food environment is adapting to the increased uptake is, I think, a really fascinating question. We did a study where we were trying to examine whether or not ultra-processed foods that were high in fat and sugar cause the same sort of dopamine increase in the brain as many addictive substances like methamphetamine, cocaine, and even nicotine. And we were really intrigued by this sort of addiction pathway that might be taking place. And we actually were surprised by what we call as scientists a null result. We actually didn't see the same kind of dopamine increase in the brain that we had expected, and certainly not to the extent of these other addictive substances. So we still have a lot of work to do in the science of trying to understand how what's the biology underlying why these products are so appealing, how the food environment actually changes the biological control of appetite and regulation of body weight, how they interact with these new GLP-1 and other obesity pharmacotherapies. I think it's a really fascinating area to unpack in the future.
Fascinating. But I think the caller's experience and your answer remind us that though ultra-processed foods is a major category we should be concerned about, and we're doing this whole health convening for about an hour and a half on the topic today, it's not the only one, because I don't know what else is in those sugary cereals, but maybe the culprit for him is just sugar, which is a natural ingredient, could even be organically grown for all we know.
Absolutely, and I think that that's part of the way that a lot of the kind of debate in the scientific literature right now and between scientists is, what is it about ultra-processed foods? Is it really that they are poor in nutrient quality, that they contain lots of sugar or high fructose corn syrup. They might be high in saturated fat or high in sodium and low in fiber and lower in protein. Or is it really something else about the processing and these other sort of artificial additives and preservatives that are being added? And that's where I think, we run into this problem, because there is a solid body of nutritional evidence on these kind of more traditional factors like sugar being in excess being bad for people, and an increasing risk of obesity and type 2 diabetes and a variety of other conditions. So unpacking the details about what it is about these dietary patterns that are poor for our health is, I think, really should be at the forefront, as opposed to just painting a wide brush and saying, oh, it's just ultra processed foods. We don't have to think about the nutrient composition, or we just have to think about the nutrient composition and don't worry about how they're produced. This is where the debate is in the science right now.
Yeah, and in our annual health convening this year on ultra-processed foods, my first guest for another few minutes, Dr. Kevin Hall, who was a National Institutes of Health expert on this for a number of years. He did resign last year, or retire early last year, because of conflict with the RFK administration there, and we'll get into that a little bit. But I want to ask you first, one of the goals of these health convenings that we do is to inform me and my colleagues at WNYC and elsewhere in the media, for that matter, about the science of the topics that we do these specials on. In addition to the listeners, is there anything you identify that you think journalists either do well in general or not on this topic, or certain questions or topics that you would like to see addressed more in the general media?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that, I would like to see a little bit more criticism of some of the studies that are published, to be honest. I see a lot of, the latest study shows. I think it would be really great that if journalists kind of did a little bit more education on the kind of different kinds of studies, what they can show, what they can't show, what they're, how to extrapolate or not extrapolate from certain studies. You mentioned for our study, yeah, it's a very small study. It was done in a very highly controlled environment on a small number of people. What does that mean? It means that you can't conclude from that everybody has a higher ultra-processed food diet is going to eat 500 calories per day more than a minimally processed diet. It was one specific dietary formulation. I told you about a follow-up study that we've presented at conferences where we've re-engineered an ultra-processed diet to not lead to those same consequences. And so I think that, one of the things that scientists often find frustrating is when journalists might over extrapolate their study results beyond what they've actually been designed to show.
Another listener question, who I think is interested in veganism, this listener, but uncertain, says, please ask your guest about supposedly better for you ultra-processed plant-based foods like Beyond Burgers or Just Eggs. What would you say to that listener?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because there are a lot of people who are concerned about animal-based products, both from an environmental perspective as well as a kind of a morality perspective. And these products are often marketed as better for you and better for the environment. We did not study those particular plant-based replacement products. Christopher Gardner from Stanford University did do a study of the Beyond Meat, I think it was in particular. And in fact, as a caveat in considering those results, the study was sponsored by Beyond Meat, so take that for what it's worth. But they showed that there were more or less similar results from burgers and meat-based products as compared to the Beyond Meat products, which tend to have higher sodium content but lower saturated fat and things like that. There were some specific things that were somewhat different, but I would argue they probably weren't clinically meaningful differences between the two products. I don't think anyone is saying that as a replacement, those kinds of products might be better than the original, but they also probably shouldn't form the foundation of a diet, which should be more along the lines of vegetables and whole grains and the kinds of things that are in our dietary guidelines.
I do want to ask about your early retirement last year. I understand you felt that they were beginning to censor you under the Trump and RFK Jr. administration. Censor you in what ways?
So they would not let us present our results at conferences. So we had that result that I mentioned about the lack of increase in dopamine in the brain in response to ultra-processed milkshakes high in fat and sugar. And when a reporter asked to interview me, that interview request was denied specifically because the spokesperson for the Department of Health and Human Services said that our results didn't match RFK Jr.'s understanding of how these foods work. In other words, there was a lot of talk at the time that these products were poison and that they caused addiction. And we weren't saying that people weren't addicted to these particular kind of foods, but we were saying that this particular biological pathway in the dopamine system in the brain might not be the way that they are operating. When the journalist,
in other words, it might addict people differently than a lot of what we would consider drugs.
Exactly, and that we still haven't identified the key addictive component of ultra-processed foods, that might result in those sorts of biological changes. More importantly, we were also experiencing at the time, we were unable to buy food for our research subjects. They had cut our ability to rehire research staff. It was a pretty dire situation at the NIH at the time. I requested some clarification about whether this was going to continue. When I wrote written responses to a journalist's interview questions, my responses were edited without my consent and passed off as if I had written them. And that was kind of the final straw that broke the camel's back. And I realized that I was unable to get the attention of these folks to discuss these matters after weeks of reaching out. And so it became clear that these folks were not interested in the science. They were interested in their narrative, and any science that deviated from their narrative, even in a minor extent, was deemed problematic.
Although in this case, that narrative was, hey, this is really addictive. Don't put anything out there that complicates the narrative for the general public. But do you think that RFK, at the end of the day, talks a good game on ultra-processed foods but isn't acting?
Yeah, I would say that many of the actions of this administration go against many of the things that we recognize as being health promoting. So, for example, we've seen changes to the food stamps or SNAP program that have eliminated the educational aspects to kind of help educate people how to prepare fresh and higher quality meals that meet dietary guidelines. We've seen cuts to programs that provided subsidies from farm to school programs that would have facilitated a shift away from ultra-processed foods in schools. So there's a variety of things that have been counterproductive to this movement, and yet the Make America Healthy Again sort of grassroots movement has viewed ultra-processed foods as one of the top priorities, and instead we focus the administration is focused on things like voluntary action by food companies to reduce certain food dyes that were not widely used in the food system to begin with, and not supporting the kinds of real science that can inform better public policy, and in fact, in my experience, has been diminishing and trying to censor that science because it might complicate their narrative.
Dr. Kevin Hall, former senior investigator at the National Institutes of Health, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been incredibly informative.
Thanks for having me.
Next up in our health convening on ultra-processed foods, one specific category of them, and colorectal cancer, including a very interesting gender difference that the researcher who will join us found. Stay with us. The Brian Lehrer Show is on tape today, so we won't be taking your calls. It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC as we continue with this year's health convening. If you're just joining us for this and didn't hear the first segment, every year WNYC hosts a health convening with support from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. The convening has typically been an opportunity for healthcare experts and practitioners to inform WNYC's health reporting in an off-the-air briefing and interaction. This is the third year that we're bringing it onto the air, as we've all decided it'll be a service for you to hear the briefing too. This year's focus is on ultra-processed foods. You may have just caught our conversation with Dr. Kevin Hall, former senior investigator at the National Institutes of Health, whose study linked ultra-processed foods to obesity. Now we'll take a different tack and look at how some of these kinds of foods are correlated with an increased risk, specifically of colorectal cancer. Colorectal cancer is now the leading cause of cancer death in Americans under 50, with cases in that age group rising 3% per year, according to the statistics that have been published by the American Cancer Society's Colorectal Cancer Statistics 2026 report. Our guest for this part of the conversation is Dr. Fang Fang Zhang, a cancer epidemiologist, MD, Ph.D., and chair of the Division of Nutrition, Epidemiology, and Data Science at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University. In 2022, for example, she published a landmark study that found that men who consumed the highest levels of ultra-processed foods had a 29% higher risk of developing colorectal cancer. Women, different, and we'll get into it. Dr. Zhang's research has helped shape our understanding of why what we eat and how it's processed may be driving that trend. Dr. Zhang, thanks so much for some time today. Welcome to WNYC.
Thank you, Brian. I'm glad to be here.
Dr. Zhang, your 2022 study is one of the most cited papers linking ultra-processed foods to colorectal cancer. I see you followed more than 200,000 healthcare professionals for over 25 years. So tell everybody briefly, what were you looking for and what did you find?
Sure. So in that study, we were trying to answer a question is, does eating more ultra-processed food increase the risk of colorectal cancer? We know that ultra-processed food make up a very large part of American diet. And there's growing evidence, right, linking these foods to a range of health issues like obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and premature death. So at that same time, that colorectal cancer is one of the cancers most strongly influenced by diet. We already know that higher intake of processed meat and lower consumption of fiber and whole grains increase risk of colorectal cancer. And many ultra-processed food tend to reflect those patterns, right? Many ultra-processed food contain processed meat and the low in fiber. So that really motivated us to look at this question in a large, long-term study. And we followed more than 200,000 men and women over about 25 years. And what we found is that among men, those who consume the highest amount of ultra-processed food had about 29% higher risk compared to those in the lowest intake. As you said, we didn't find the same association in women. And also I want to notice some differences in the type of ultra-processed food. For example, the higher consumption of processed meats, those as hot dogs, sausage, deli meats, and sugar-sweetened beverages was linked with higher risk in men. And in women, we saw higher risk related to certain ready-to-eat mixed dishes like pizza. On the other hand, we found some foods like yogurt were actually associated with a lower risk in women.
Even though you consider yogurt a processed food?
Well, it depends that what type of yogurt. So the yogurt that just plain, right, just made of milk and cultures, they're not considered ultra-processed. They're considered to be minimally processed. However, the yogurt with added sugar and other additives like stabilizers, they are considered ultra-processed.
So this study, and by the way, folks, it was published in the British Medical Journal in 2022, if you ever want to look up the actual thing, but it found the strongest cancer association was with a specific category, and you were starting to get into it a minute ago, and I'm going to ask you to talk more about it. Meat, poultry, and seafood-based ready-to-eat products. So that's not to say all meat and seafood and poultry, but certain kinds of packaged meat and seafood and poultry processed foods, packaged foods. Can you describe what those are specifically?
Correct. Yeah, those are, as you mentioned, those are not all, right? It's a processed products. Bacon, sausage, deli meats. Those are the major types of the processed meat in this category.
What's the mechanism? Do you know? What about those increases somebody's risk of colorectal cancer?
Yeah, there are a few biological mechanisms can help explain that link. And one is that processed meats contain preservatives. Those are nitrates and nitrites. They can turn into compounds in our body that are known to damage the DNA. And that's an early step in the cancer process. At the same time, these meats, especially those made from red meat, they contain a type of iron that trigger the chemical reaction in the colon, and they can produce substances that can irritate and damage the bowel lining. And then there's also how these foods are prepared. Smoking, curing, and cooking meat at high temperatures can create additional chemicals that can also damage the DNA in the colon cells. So when you put all these together, the colon is essentially exposed to a mixture of the DNA damaging compounds plus ongoing irritation inflammation. So over time, that creates the kind of environment where cancer is more likely to develop. There's also newer research
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
at no worries, that looking at other things that people talk about, right? What are the things people added to ultra-processed food, such as additives, and could also be the chemicals contained, the packaging of ultra-processed food, and also could be the things that are formed that during high temperature processing. And these have been actively, I feel, investigated, but still evidence still limited. So with that, I would say that we still don't know whether there's clear evidence linking these additives or packaging chemicals to the cancer development in the colon and rectum. I think I feel those new mechanisms needs to be further studied.
Mm-hmm. Santos in Park Slope has a question, I think, about what he can eat in the meat categories that you were describing. Santos, you're on WNYC with Dr. Zhang. Hi.
Hi. Yes. Are any of the lunch meats and lunch foods like sliced cheeses, cheddar, Swiss, are any of the deli meats safe to eat?
Yeah, I think that for the cheese, right, you mentioned about the cheese also depends on the processing. And if the processing level gets to the ultra process where those are the things that having the additives that highly processed, industrially processed, that gets to the ultra processed food category. But some cheese not considered to be processed rather than ultra processed. I know it's hard to make that distinction, but if we look at the ingredients, if you turn the package of these foods and look at ingredients, that the ingredients that you saw, that's something you're not familiar with, that are more likely to be ultra processed. So I would try to stay away from the ultra processed category of the meat.
We have a couple of questions coming in from listeners and texts about the multifactorial nature of colorectal cancer. One listener writes, what do you believe about other factors that often go with eating ultra-processed foods? For example, less activity. Oftentimes people who eat processed foods cook less for themselves. Therefore, you can assume ingredients are less quality. Another one says, a lack of fiber is often considered one of the worst elements of ultra-processed foods. Please ask the doc if adding lots of fiber to a diet high in ultra-processed foods would help ameliorate the risk. What do you think about either of those?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Diet is complex, as the audience asked. It's not just one diet, right? It's not just one ingredient. So indeed, most of the ultra-processed food are low in dietary fiber. So there are healthier categories of ultra-processed food high in fiber, like whole grains, right? So these might be the healthy version of ultra-processed food. Just like in our study that we look at different types of ultra-processed food, find differences. It's also possible that certain subtypes of ultra-processed food are healthier. They contain high amount of fiber than the other ultra-processed food. But I also want to just also be careful that some ultra-processed food despite their whole grains or high in fiber, they could contain high amount of added sugar. So I think that we want also to pay attention that just not one ingredient, but the overall quality of that food.
On sugar, we know sugar can contribute to obesity. You described some of the mechanism before by which processed meats might cause colorectal cancer. How does sugar?
Yeah, I think that's first thing I want to clarify, right? Between sugar and colorectal cancer is not as simple as like sugar feeds cancer cells, because all cells in our body, healthier cells and cancer cells, use sugar for energy. So eating sugar does not directly send fuels to cancer cells or make cancer grow in a direct way. But I think what cancer does is through weight gain, obesity. We know that obesity is an established risk factor for colorectal cancer. In fact, 13 types of cancers are linked with obesity. So that excess body fat creates a biological environment that favors cancer development. So I think for the link between sugar-sweetened beverages, which we found, right, sugar-sweetened beverage consumption increased risk of colorectal cancer is likely through increasing the risk of obesity.
Another listener says her stepdad has colorectal cancer and he's been vegan and active his whole life, so it doesn't always have to do with what you eat. It's sometimes unpreventable. And we shouldn't underestimate the role of genetics in colorectal cancer, correct?
True, yeah. Nearly all the diseases has this gene and environment, right? Both composition that contributes, and sometimes the interaction between the two.
Tell me more about the gender differences, because I see your 2022 landmark study found that men who consume the highest levels of ultra-processed foods, I think in that case it was mostly those meats and packaged seafood products, had a 29% higher risk of developing colorectal cancer, but not so much in women. Tell us more.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the honest answer is that it's likely a combination of factors, and we don't fully understand yet. So in our study, as mentioned, we saw our clear association in men, but not overall in women. I think there's possible explanations. One possibility is that men and women eat different types of ultra-processed food, even that they eat the same amount. So then the overall association can look different. And also that the risk of colorectal cancer itself differs in men and women. Men had a higher risk of colorectal cancer than women. And the hormones like estrogen may have some protective effects in the colon for women, but not in men. So these biological differences could influence how ultra-processed food affect the risk of colorectal cancer. And there's also differences potentially in how the gut microbiome interacts with diet, that differently by sex. So I would say that the takeaway is not that ultra-processed food, I won't say it's safe for women, even though we didn't find association there, right? But it's that the relationship's more nuanced, and I think we need more research to fully understand such a sex difference pattern with regard to ultra-processed food.
Christine in Westchester was calling about specifically this. Christine, I'm curious if Dr. Zhang just answered your question or if you have a follow-up.
Thank you so much. She did answer the question. I think my follow-up is that, do you think that more research will be done onto that and, linked to that, the increased amount of young people? I'm a young person who's recently diagnosed. And just thank you for bringing attention to this, and will more be done to find out those risk factors?
Yeah, this is the great question you ask, because there's another paper published looking at adenomas, those that are sort of the early stage of colorectal cancer, right? Our study is looking at the risk of developing cancer itself. But in that study, that they did found that ultra-processed food consumption is associated with a high risk of adenomas.
The adenomas, we often call those polyps, right?
Correct, that polyps in women under age 50. Right? So I think those two things, they polyps and cancer don't always line up perfectly. But in younger population, there are often enough cancer cases yet in that study to detect a clear association, even if the process has already begun. So I think it actually adds important pieces of the puzzle. It may suggest that ultra-processed food may be playing a role early in that age, right? It lines with the broad concern as our audience that you just mentioned, that we are seeing the rising cases of colorectal cancer diagnosed at a young age. I think for which diet and lifestyle factors could be especially important.
Before you go, and we bring on former FDA Commissioner Dr. David Kessler, who's on a campaign now to get more regulation of certain ultra-processed foods. One of the goals of these health convenings that we do is to inform me and my colleagues at WNYC and elsewhere in the media about the science of the topics that we do these specials on. So is there anything you would identify that journalists either do well or not so well when covering ultra-processed foods, or anything you would like to see in the journalistic space on the topic of your specialty?
Yeah. I think would be very, it's more maybe for the research perspective or policy perspective. To me, I feel that it's really hard for individuals to change what we eat, because ultra-processed food is everywhere, right? Like more than 50%, half of the calories that adults consume ultra-processed food. So I really think it's important to have policy level changes. That is important to help the general public, that we all of us to recognize or what are ultra-processed food to make healthy choices, but we need tools, we need policies to help us to make that informed choices. I think that you're going to talk more about the policy, what could be useful, that helpful for the public to reduce the ultra-processed food consumption. So I myself, I think that would be important to hear more in the future in order to really to reduce the diet-related chronic diseases that attribute to ultra-processed food consumption.
I definitely hear you. Thank you for that recommendation. We will take it very seriously. And we thank Dr. Fang Fang Zhang, cancer epidemiologist and chair of the Division of Nutrition Epidemiology and Data Science at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University. Thank you so much for joining our health convening today. This was really informative, I think, helpful to a lot of listeners and journalists alike.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Brian.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. Our health convening continues in a minute with Dr. Kessler. Stay with us. It's a best of Brian Lehrer show today, so we won't be taking your calls. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. We are in our annual health convening, which WNYC hosts every year with support from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, as an opportunity for healthcare experts and practitioners to inform WNYC's health reporting. And this year, as you've been hearing for most of the show, we are, for the third year now, bringing it onto the air for all of you as well, even as we take notes on this show and elsewhere in our news department. And we are tackling ultra-processed foods as this year's health convening topic. What are they? How do they impact our health? And how can the food system in the United States change? For our final installment today, we're joined now by Dr. David Kessler, who is perhaps best known for taking on industries that profit from addiction. As FDA commissioner under both Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton through the 1990s, he brought tobacco executives before Congress, remember that, some of you, and argued successfully that the FDA had the authority to regulate nicotine as a drug. And now he's trying to do something similar with ultra-processed foods. Last August, Dr. Kessler filed a citizen's petition, as it's called, with the FDA, arguing that the very ingredients that make ultra-processed foods what they are, like corn syrup and maltodextrin, should no longer be considered generally recognized as safe. Now, that's a legal designation that we're going to get into with him because it's central to this conversation. Generally recognized as safe, or known by the acronym GRAS, that has allowed the food industry to introduce thousands of industrial ingredients into the food supply without formal FDA review or approval. Dr. Kessler says that loophole needs to be closed. Now, this past February, Health Secretary RFK Jr. said on 60 Minutes that the FDA would act on Dr. Kessler's petition, but he stopped short of saying the administration would regulate the ultra-processed food. So where does that leave us? Let's find out. Dr. David Kessler is also a pediatrician and a lawyer, as well as former FDA commissioner. He's the former dean of the medical schools at Yale and UC San Francisco, and the author of multiple books on food and health, including his most recent, Diet, Drugs, and Dopamine, the New Science of Achieving a Healthy Weight. Dr. Kessler, so nice of you to join us. We're honored to have you. Welcome to WNYC.
Thank you for having me, Brian, and thanks for the important work you're doing.
Thank you. The core legal argument in your petition involves this thing called GRAS, or GRAS, which stands for Generally Recognized as Safe. I took a stab at defining it in the intro just now. You argue that the FDA is legally obligated to revisit it for these ingredients, so many ingredients. So what is this loophole exactly? What are you calling on the FDA to revisit?
So we are asking that the petition that we filed calls on the administration to remove processed refined carbohydrates from the food supply on the basis that, as you just said, they are no longer considered generally recognized as safe or GRAS. Now, can I explain what GRAS is and then the reason for the petition? So if you want to add something to the food supply, there's a relatively high burden that Congress set back in the 1950s. If you want to add, it's called a food additive, you have to show that the additive is safe for use under the conditions it's used. So you have to show it's safe. And safety is defined as reasonable certainty of no harm. And you have to go through an entire application process. You have to study it. You have to submit petitions. You submit the food additive petition. FDA looks at that. There is an exception in the law. There was an exception that was put in. It was put in for grandfathered substances primarily. This is what is called GRAS. And if you were generally recognized as safe, then you were exempted from putting in that food additive petition. So it was, in some ways, it was the loophole that became the rule. Because the majority of substances that are added to food today come in under this GRAS exception. Now, this was looked at, the GRAS status of these refined carbohydrates was looked at 4 decades ago. And it's during those 4 or 5 decades that we see this crisis that America became, the American body became ill. We became obese. It's not about weight. I mean, it's very important. Why are we doing this? Is the fact that only 12% of us are generally healthy from a metabolic perspective when you look at things like blood pressure or blood lipids or waist circumference. 25% of us will go on to have heart failure. 30% of us will become diabetic. 25% of us will have a stroke. And we're waking up to the fact, again, it's not just weight. It's that visceral fat, that fat in places in our abdomen where fat does not belong. And that's responsible. That visceral adiposity is responsible for much of the cardiorenal metabolic disease, the chronic disease, certain forms of cancer, and even neurodegenerative disease. So enormous chronic disease burden. And when this was looked at 4 decades ago, these refined carbohydrates, you go look at the Federal Register back in the 1980s, the fact that GRAS determination was based on outdated data. They did not properly establish the biological effects of these processed refined carbohydrates. The GRASS affirmation statement written back in 1988 said there was no link between these refined sweeteners and carbohydrates and obesity, no link with cardiovascular disease and diabetes. That is no longer true. So there is no expert consensus that these refined carbohydrates and ultra-processed foods are safe under the present conditions of use. And that, in my opinion, leaves FDA with no choice but to determine that processed refined carbohydrates, as a matter of science and law, can no longer considered to be GRAS and thus must be removed from commerce.
So, to what you were just saying, Dr. Kessler, your petition to the FDA doesn't actually use the phrase ultra-processed foods. Instead, you focused on processed, refined carbohydrates. So are you saying that other things that we've talked about during this special, the things in, processed deli meats and stuff, aren't as much concern, or just that they're being regulated better already than these processed refined carbohydrates, which are falling through this giant loophole?
No, I'm just using the processed refined carbohydrates, in part because of how the Food and Drug law works, but also as markers of these ultra-processed foods. Look, in the end, we are eating about 500 to 1,000 calories more today than we did 4 decades ago. And that is because we're eating more calorie-dense, less satiating, engineered foods. The foods that were engineered for overconsumption. These were hyper palatable. You can call them ultra processed, ultra formulated. To me, a ultra processed food has 4 components. It has sweeteners, it has refined starches and flours, it has added fats and oils, and it has salt. And I'm focusing on 2 of those components, the refined sweeteners, the refined flours and starches. But that covers about 80% of all ultra-processed foods. When you walk into those central aisles, most things, if they're going to have added fats and oils and that salt, they're also going to have the refined processed carbohydrates.
On 60 Minutes earlier this year, you said these ingredients trigger metabolic havoc, that the calories from ultra-processed foods aren't just empty, they end up as fat in the liver and migrate to other organs. What's the biological mechanism that you're describing, and how good is the evidence?
I think the evidence is very good. And the fact is that medicine is waking up to the fact that it is fat in places where fat does not belong that is responsible for much of the chronic cardiovascular, metabolic, renal disease that we're experiencing. Over the last 50 years, the United States, people in the United States have been exposed on a mass population-wide scale to something I think that our biology was never designed to handle. These energy-dense, rapidly absorbable, highly palatable, ultra-processed foods. The industry learned in the 40s and 50s to feed a hungry nation, to be able to ship food across, state lines, to have food be shelf stable, to design a whole palette of products of these rapidly absorbable, energy-dense, highly palatable foods. But no one asked the question, what is it going to do to our metabolism? And this exposure fundamentally altered, I believe, our metabolism, and it produced the largest increase in chronic disease in modern history. It includes type 2 diabetes, prediabetes, fatty liver disease, hypertension, kidney disease, abnormal blood lipids, heart attacks, strokes, and heart failure. No one asked the question, what was the effect of these ultra-processed foods on our metabolic health?
Joseph in Dover, New Jersey has a question for you. Joseph, you're on WNYC with Dr. Kessler. Hi.
Hi, thank you for taking the call. I just want to quickly comment that the entire discussion thus far seems to focus on the ingredients in ultra-processed foods and not the word processing, which always has concerned me. I'm concerned about the effect of the method of processing, of cooking foods, I imagine, in large vats, suddenly raised to high temperatures with under pressure or steam. if I buy a jar of spaghetti sauce in the store, I'm sure it's not cooked slowly simmered the way an Italian grandma might cook it. I sometimes buy some processed products. I bought some preservative-free, what do they call it, uncured hot dogs recently, turkey hot dogs, and I only saw what looked like friendly ingredients, turkey, maybe some salt, nothing that I wouldn't use myself, but I wonder the nature of the processing might have adverse effects. That's
Great
my
question, Joseph. Thank you very much. Dr. Kessler.
It's a very insightful question. No doubt that industrial processing weaponizes carbohydrates, these added fats and oils, at a scale that goes far beyond anything possible in home cooking. The reason why I focus on these processed refined carbohydrates is the Food and Drug Act doesn't regulate processing in the abstract. It regulates ingredients. So you can regulate ingredients that have been processed, but you have to link it to a specific substance. So that's why I'm focusing on the processed refined carbohydrates. And look, it's those processed refined carbohydrates, those rapidly absorbable carbohydrates, are being put in our bodies and absorbed at a rate. If you look over the last 20 years, there's been a doubling of hyperinsulinemia. Now I know that's a big word, but the response to those rapidly absorbable carbohydrates is the rate of rise of just putting in that sugar into our bloodstream and stimulating this metabolic chaos. I mean, that leads, right, one, to not only have us eat more and more because it stimulates the dopamine reward circuits, but it also leads to this hyperinsulinemia, this metabolic chaos. So these extra 500, 1,000 calories, this additional fat that gets deposited in our liver in places it doesn't belong, we now know that's causative. It's in the causal chain of these diseases.
So when you filed your petition with the FDA to reopen the investigation of this causality, it sounds like when you took on tobacco in the 1990s, you described finding the regulatory hook, that is the legal question that framed your argument, and you said the same challenge exists here with the food industry. So since you were so central to that, back in the 90s, what happened when tobacco companies had to prove their products were safe? And what lessons do you think we should learn that might apply here at the level of the federal government?
You're exactly right. I mean, in fact, when we acted back in the 1990s, there was a citizens' petition, not dissimilar from the citizens' petition that we filed here on ultra-processed food. And that petition, I mean, it asked specifically to regulate low-tar cigarettes. We actually changed the question of whether nicotine was a drug under the act. That gave us that regulatory hook under the existing statute. Here, the regulatory hook is that all these substances came on the market under this GRAS loophole. But the great thing about this GRAS, exemption is that the manufacturers have the burden. If you want to call it GRAS, if you want to come under this route, manufacturers retain that burden to show that in fact, these substances can be used, and at the doses that they're being used, and cumulatively with all these compounds together, that they're really GRAS. So what the petition says, and what I'm asking FDA to do, is to say, okay, industry, you put all this stuff on the market under GRAS, show us the studies that show this is metabolically safe, and if not, then start to remove these.
And so Secretary Kennedy appeared in a separate interview on the same 60 Minutes episode that you were interviewed for, that we mentioned before, and in response to your petition, he said the FDA would act on it, but he was careful to say that he's not proposing to regulate ultra-processed foods as a category. Here's a few seconds of that.
When you're taking on ultra-processed foods, you're also taking on powerful industries, big ag, big food. What makes you believe you will prevail?
My belief that I will prevail is because we have the president behind us.
But the president has shown himself to be pretty much against regulations. So why would he support regulating ultra-processed foods?
Well, I'm not saying that we're going to regulate ultra-processed food. Our job is to make sure that everybody understands what they're getting, to have an informed public.
RFK Jr. with CBS's Bill Whitaker. What do you make of that exchange? Is he on the bus or off the bus?
Well, I think we're going to see, the administration has not yet acted. I am hopeful that they will act. I'm told this is under active consideration, and I hope they call on the food industry to do the science, show us the science on whether these ultra-processed foods are safe or to remove them. I think one of the most important things to me, here's what I think is one of the real opportunities. I think this is an issue that we can pursue without it becoming an issue of the right or left. It's without becoming weaponized. Yes, the industry will come after us, just like tobacco. But if we can keep this clearly in mind and understand that these ultra-processed foods are contributing to that extra 1,500 or 1,000 calories, to this toxic fat that is getting into our organs and causing this metabolic disease. If we can do that, I mean, if there can be a consensus from all sides of the political spectrum, then I think there's real opportunity. So I am hopeful.
Natasha in Ridgewood, Queens. You're on WNYC with Dr. David Kessler. Hi.
Hi there. Thanks for taking my call. My question is about how this conversation relates to the conversation around changing the school lunch program, and if there's any impact to, or like legislation that can be put forward, or policy, forgive me if I'm saying the wrong words here, but to pressure the departments of health and education around the country to change the way that food looks in cafeterias. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that's such a great question, not only in general, but for you, because I think you have a pediatrics background, don't you?
Absolutely. And this metabolic chaos that occurs, I mean, these changes occur over a lifetime. And they begin, as soon as we start consuming these ultra-processed foods and lay down this visceral adiposity. So these changes occur over a lifetime. And that's why, the caller is absolutely right. Beginning early, not only in, what we're exposed to, but what we like and what we want to put in our bodies. Look, in the end, fair to say, Brian, that tobacco, one of the great public health successes in our lifetime?
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Right. I mean,
considering
we can leave aside
how far down the rate of smoking has come.
Right. I mean, leave aside vaping. That we have that issue, but certainly when it comes to cigarettes, remarked reduction in that. How did that happen? Certainly there was legislation, there was regulation, there was taxes. Remember the CEOs testifying. But at the end of the day, what happened, in my parents' and grandparents' generation, they viewed cigarettes as something that they wanted, something that would make them feel better, that was positively valenced, right? And when you're dealing with an addictive substance, how you view it is absolutely critical. What we did is we had this critical perceptual shift. We reversed that valence from positive to negative in this country. And so how we view these products, when we understand what the damage these ultra-processed foods are doing to our bodies and the range of diseases, sure, we need to regulate. Sure, absolutely critical that we start with a school lunch program, and that is being done. But the fact is, we need to look at these products differently.
In our last minute, as I've asked each of the guests today, one of the goals of these health convenings that we do is to inform me and my colleagues at WNYC and elsewhere in the media about the science of the topics we do these specials on, so that we do better journalism, hopefully in the future. So are there certain questions or topics that you would like to see addressed more in the general media pertaining to this?
Well, I think the earlier conversation that you had was on early onset colorectal cancer. We have to find the causative agent. I mean, and you had Kevin Hall. I mean, we have to have NIH, that budget, the kind of work that Kevin did at the NIH, getting the answers, I mean, to how these ultra-processed foods actually do their harm. I mean, we have to maintain and sustain our biomedical greatness. But the goal, I think, is, with all these controversial issues or allegedly controversial, I mean, that we talk about, finding that consensus, Brian, that underlying consensus, that's how policy is changed.
Dr. David Kessler, who among all the things that he's done in his life is also the author of the new book, Diet, Drugs, and Dopamine, The New Science of Achieving a Healthy Weight. Thank you for sticking the landing in this health convening today. We appreciate your time so much.
Thanks for the heroic work, Brian.
And that's our health convening. Listeners, we hope this was useful for you. Journalists tuning in, we hope it was useful for you. The Brian Lehrer Show is on tape today, so we won't be taking your calls. It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. Here's a take on the United States at 250 years old. It's a book with more than 100 excerpts of different things, I'll explain the context in a sec, from the nation's history. About what? About the history of religion in the country, from indigenous religions that the European settlers learned about when they got here, through the Puritans, Abraham Lincoln, atheists, feminist spiritualists, both Stephen Colbert and Donald Trump, believe it or not, the adoption of the motto, "In God We Trust," which only came in the 1950s, and many others, including Malcolm X in the 1960s.
I'm a Muslim. I believe in the religion of Islam, which believes in brotherhood, complete brotherhood of all people. But at the same time that I believe in this brotherhood, I don't believe in forcing my desire for brotherhood upon those who aren't willing to accept it.
Of course, I think the Christians would say that they also believed in brotherhood. What did you say to that?
I'd say they believe in it, but don't practice it.
Well, that'd be a pretty good answer.
Malcolm X on the CBC back then. Our next guest is Alon Stavins, Professor of Humanities and Latin American and Latino Culture at Amherst College and publisher of the imprint Restless Books. His own new book, published by that imprint, is called A Nation Wrestles with God, American Prophets, Philosophers, and Firebrands. Hi, Professor Stavins. Welcome back to WNYC.
It's such a joy to be with you again.
Do you have a thesis in this book? We're going to go through some excerpts. I know you brought some things to read. I have a couple of clips. But is this just like a beautiful mosaic of people from, before the United States was a country, right up through Donald Trump, expounding on religion? Or do you have a through line here?
I think the main purpose of this is, first, as an immigrant myself, born Jew in Mexico, who came to the United States in the 80s, in the mid-80s. It is a love letter and a thank you note to this country that is so complex, and particularly through the prism of religion and through the vision of God. And maybe if there is a message or an argument, is that a country of 335 million people, a country with around 375 different faith groups in the United States, how is it that we all stick together? What do we say when we talk about religion? Do we all have a single God, or are there many gods, as many as believers and faith groups and religious institutions. And is it only us individually and nationally that are constantly wrestling and bargaining and fighting and embracing God? Or might it also be said that God looks for us in different ways, and God is also being changed in the process of America changing in 250 years or many more before the actual independence?
Ah, God changing. So that kind of accepts a premise that man created God rather than God created man.
Yeah, I think it's a dialectic between the two. Certainly, God is a projection of our fears to the unknown, our need for higher powers, maybe a desire to have some kind of authority entity or figure that narrates the story and with whom we feel comfort. But it is also that in this vast and very chaotic universe, the higher powers might be also looking for followers, and I believe in that connection between the two that is constantly being transformed.
All right, so let's do some sampling from the items in the book and from history. And many people might think of Christianity as America's first religion, but as we know, there were many indigenous people who called this land their home before the settlers from Europe did. The battle for land included a battle for culture, and you include, I guess we could call it a sobering 1854 speech by Chief Seattle, who said, "Your God is not our God. Your God loves your people and hates mine." And so, Alon, that's tough stuff and a competition of the gods in Chief Seattle's telling. What was the context for that?
Yeah, first let me contextualize this. This
Please.
competition for God, for the attention of God, runs through our culture from the very beginning, and it's likely to go on till the end. Different groups use God to showcase supremacy or to denigrate other groups. Upon arrival, there were a variety of religious beliefs in the indigenous population, and the book showcases many of them, many different tribes who see other tribes as being different and likely inferior to them. But it is particularly against the white man, as it's being described in the 17th and 18th century, the white man that has come to impose a God that must be celebrated, must be bowed to in an unconditional way. Chief Seattle and others in the book of indigenous background say, do not, to their own followers, do not be fooled by that lie, that the sudden arrival of an outsider God is going to mess our own beliefs, and we should stick to who we are and what we have. It is the same premise that other groups, immigrant groups, slaves, other groups that have come and formed new religions here will constantly, recurrently be stating our God is the one that is superior and beware of the other ones. All in the context of the borders that keep on expanding in this nation, from the arrival of the Mayflower to the Manifest Destiny and the conquest of the new territories.
So that's in the context of that conquest. Do you have anything in there from one of your other indigenous sources that just kind of expresses a notion of God that, or a way to observe religion that the Europeans may not have been familiar with until they got here?
Yes, absolutely. The anthology actually starts with Navajo chants that, ironically, Brian, are very similar to maybe Buddhist or Hinduist religions. These are statements in lyrical form that pay tribute to nature as a manifestation of the higher power. And it is that nature that has to be taken care of, that has to be curated, that has to be bowed to. It is fascinating because it won't be until the mid 19th century with figures like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry Thoreau, and others who will be the first ones that bring Eastern religions into the American fold, who are going to suggest that God is actually not an old man or not a crucified entity or a trinity. It is the entire cosmos, and that we are part of that larger chessboard, so to speak. This is an ongoing debate, and even within Western thought, the book states in a number of different places that by the time in 1776 this republic was found, the idea of the Bible as the only central document that proposed a vision of God that needed to be embraced, or you would suffer the consequences, had been debunked by European thinkers like Spinoza, among others, a major background figure in the shaping of what the founding fathers ultimately created in order to have the country that we have. And it comes very similar to the indigenous population that was before the arrival of Europeans.
If you're just joining us, listeners, my guest is Ilan Stavins, Professor of Humanities and Latin American and Latino Culture at Amherst College, and author of the new book, A Nation Wrestles with God, American Prophets, Philosophers, and Firebrands. And it's more than 100 excerpts of religious writings or speeches from the 250-year history of the United States and even before. There's an excerpt by Cotton Mather, who was a Puritan who believed witchcraft was real. He supported the Salem witch trials and also thought that slavery was God's will. But then 10 pages later, you also include the work of Phyllis Wheatley Peters, the first black woman to publish a book of poetry in the United States. She was born enslaved and had a deep faith in God. Can you give us context or even a taste of each excerpt?
Yes, but let me, before I do that, just stress that passing point that you made. That is what an anthology does. It creates connections between different authors that apparently are disconnected. And the fact that we are putting together these two, a slave owner and a proponent of the vision that the evil is spreading all over and that we have to be cautious, and who defended the Salem witchcrafts as Cotton Mather did, next to Phyllis Wheatley, I think shows what an extraordinary nation this is that can allow both to coexist in the same place. In his very important book, The Wonders of the Invisible World, Cotton Mather says that the devil has come down unto us with great wrath, that we find and feel and now deplore, and that we should be constantly on the alert to that force that might take us in the wrong direction. The evil in this case is a force that is even tempting God, and it's a force that exists in the universe outside of humans. Conversely, Phyllis Wheatley, a former slave, the first woman who ever wrote poetry, a very influential voice, in a poem called Thoughts on the Works of Providence. She concludes this beautiful poem, originally published in 1773, 3 years before the independence. Almighty, in these wondrous works of thine, says the last stanza, what power, what wisdom, and what goodness shine, and are thy wonders, Lord, by men explored, and yet creating glory unadorned. And Phyllis Wheatley might be said to be the forerunner of establishing social justice among us, because if God loves everybody the same, everybody should be the same as they relate to one another. So these poems, these stanzas, as beautiful as they are, they also have a political bent that will reverberate in our culture, in our literature for many, many, many decades.
You also quote the character Huckleberry Finn. That's in the book's introduction. And you talk about how the book is proof that even atheists wrestle with God. I mean, much of America is secular these days, and we're going to get to that. But what did the Huck Finn character say that can teach us about secular America's relationship to religion?
Brian, Huck is my favorite character in American literature. To me, it's ground zero. I adore him. And a 12, 13-year-old is to me a role model in a society that is absolutely fragmented and bankrupt, that believes in slavery. This little child runs away and finds his own journey with a runaway slave down the Mississippi. What better image can we have of the journey that America has than these two individuals, two pariahs that are looking to find their own way of responding to the very challenging times that they have. And Huck, who comes from an abusive family, a drunk father, an aunt who is constantly beating him, at one point in the book has to decide between good and evil. He doesn't necessarily connect it with God. He hasn't developed a vision of God, but he knows that there's good and evil, and he concludes in having to choose between both of them that he is going to go for evil, meaning he's going to run away and he's not going to perpetuate the patterns of slavery and abuse that everybody else is doing in that time. So an atheist or an agnostic, a little kid, becomes a kind of a Buddhist figure or a master that teaches us all that sometimes we have to say no to institutions and to larger paradigms that are defining us and take the path less explored. I find that Huck Finn in many ways will be echoed by many others who are atheists. The book is filled with atheists and agnostics who, because they are wrestling with the absence of God, they try to figure out how to conceive of morality, how to engage with our neighbors in a way that is far beyond institutions. And that's a very American way of doing things.
Who's another example of that from the book?
There are many other examples in the book, some of them controversial. There are authors in the book that I think people will find surprising. There are many scientists in the book, like Stephen Jay Gould, who, as accomplished as he was, he wrestled with the concept of God throughout his life and wrote very eloquently about it. Albert Einstein, an immigrant who ended up suggesting that God plays dice with all of us. That's also in the book. There is an especially significant poem in the book, Brian, that has a lot of resonance for me, as I am a grandchild of people who went through the Holocaust. It's by Katia Molodowski, and it's called God of Mercy. And it is a poem in which she, writing in Yiddish, tells God, please, please choose another people. We are tired of being the chosen one. We are tired of carrying in our shoulders the misery of the entire humankind. And I find this not only significant because I myself am Jewish, but because America is also built on the concept that we are the chosen nation, that we are exclusive, and that God has pushed us to do something that will be a model to others, as an idea taken from the Hebrew Bible and from many other Jewish sources.
You mentioned Spinoza before, and I think that prompted a call from Richard in Jamaica. Richard, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Oh, hello, Brian. Thank you. Another great program, feather in your cap. Yes, Spinoza, of course, he was a pantheist, and he believed that God and the universe are one, and that God was not anthropomorphic, so to speak. He believed that miracles were impossible, and the Bible is a work of human literature, so much so that he was excommunicated during his lifetime for that belief by the Amsterdam Jewish community. So just another facet of how we look at God and how we approach God.
Richard, thank you very much. Anything more on that, or how it connects with what you were saying about Spinoza's influence on some of the founders' religious sense?
It connects dramatically, and I thank very much the listener for his thoughts. Yes, this is a country of runaways. We started with pilgrims, at least we started in the modern concept, but many of the indigenous people were also runaways from different tribes. It is a disservice to see them always as peaceful and amicable to one another in a country where we excommunicate, we censor people today because of their ideas. What happened to Spinoza is not unique. And so, in any discussion of the role that God plays, one has to take into account the kind of a elbowing that happens all the time of those that disagree and that push that individual with new ideas, with new views to the side, and eventually that individual gets a new quorum and finds a new religion and pushes for things that are newly American from a perspective that is unique.
And another listener, maybe related a little bit, writes, can you ask the guest about deism? Apparently, deism, not traditional Christianity, was the main belief system of many American founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, and others. It's a word you're familiar with, right?
Absolutely, and it plays a very important role in the book. It's a word that we don't use today, but it's the conviction that there is such a God and that God is above everything, but it doesn't necessarily have to come from one religious perspective or another. That God entity is the fountain of everything that we do, even when you ignore it or move beyond it. Washington and Jefferson, there's a piece by Jefferson on that. There are various other reactions, particularly in the 19th century, of the deism. But if I may, Brian, I want to simply mention the only author in the book that is actually a non-American. He wasn't born here, and he wasn't also an immigrant who came here. One could say that he was an ethnographer or maybe a tourist, an intellectual tourist. I'm talking about the great Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote that beautiful mirror that he gave us, the democracy in America, telling us how this Frenchman sees us. There's an excerpt in the book that serves as an epigraph. It is not from Democracy in America. It's from his book, The Old Regime and the French Revolution. And he says in it, I have sometimes asked Americans whom I chance to meet on their own country or in Europe, whether in their opinion, religion contributes to the stability of the state and the maintenance of law and order. They always answered without a moment's hesitation that a civilized community, especially one that enjoys the benefits of freedom, cannot exist without religion. In fact, an American sees in religion the surest guarantee of the stability of the state and the safety of individuals. This is, if for some, a very controversial statement, but I think that religion, even without God, it serves as an organizing principle that has been fundamental for the shaping of this country in 250 years.
Now to something completely different. One person in the anthology might seem like a less obvious addition to some people. I mean, many might. But the one we're going to sample from is Lana Del Rey. You include her song, God Knows I Tried. Let's listen to a little.
God knows I lost, but God gave me life, and God knows I tried. God knows I tried.
For the uninitiated, who is Lana Del Rey, and why did she make it into your book?
Lana Del Rey is another example in the book, Brian, of the crucial dimension that is popular culture as a screen or as a space where we explore God. There is so much that we do in movies, in miniseries, in the lyrics of songs by Bruce Springsteen, by Bob Dylan, by many, many others. And I first wanted this not to be a book only by and about theologians. I wanted to show that it is all all Americans that are always wrestling with God, and that wrestling manifests itself in all kinds of ways, in a cartoon, in a mural, in a children's song, in a hymn, in a sermon, in a speech. And Lana Del Rey, who has this exquisite voice, is a perfect example of that dimension that we're always looking. So we might find ourselves in the car listening to a popular singer that is connecting us with a religious dimension, or we might open the newspaper or surf the internet and find a cartoon or an emoji that connects us with God. That is also theology. That is also religion. That is also a manifestation of how we are looking constantly for some kind of validation, or at the very least for an explanation to the doubts that we have.
Listener writes, I think your guest overestimates how non-religious people, quote, struggle with the concept of morality or the absence of a God. It's actually quite easy, writes this listener. There is a rather large body of research showing how evolution shaped animal behavior and, by extension, human morality. So I don't know if you want to talk back to that listener, but maybe use that as the segue into the rise in non-belief, or at least religiously unaffiliated, these days in the country.
Yeah, I don't know if I would talk back, but I would talk with the listener. There is a clear sense that we are obviously creatures of evolution, and that the vision that we had in biblical times or in medieval times is very different from where we are today. But I argue, and this is a 65-year-old arguing, Brian, people, by the way, tend to become more maybe spiritual or have deeper questions about what will happen after life as they grow older than ignoring as many scientists or rejecting the concept of God isn't necessarily a way of making that concept absent. In the Origins of Species of Darwin, he spends the entire last chapter thinking that if there is an evolution of things, where does all this start? Could there have been a primary force that pushed the very first cell, the very first molecule? Freud, Einstein, Newton, all of them in one way or another, deep and very persuasive scientists themselves negotiated with higher forces, higher powers. And the same thing goes with artists. Artists like Shakespeare might be described as somebody who's hiding his religion. He's not an American, obviously. I'm just using his as an example. But ultimately, there is a palpitating desire among his many characters to understand larger causes, in Hamlet, in Romeo and Juliet, that I think never fully eliminates the concept of God. If we could do that, we would have done that. We would have eliminated the word altogether 50, 100, 200 years ago. I don't think it will ever disappear. And by the way, in the end, we're only talking about a word, God, G-O-D. And that word is spelled and it's pronounced differently in different languages, but every single language that I know, every single culture, in one way or another, accounts for this higher spirit with a word that tries to tame it, or at least tries to present it in a way that others can engage with.
We'll continue in a minute with Alon Stavins and more from his anthology, A Nation Wrestles with God. Stay with us. It's a best of Brian Lehrer show today, so we won't be taking your calls. Brian Lehrer on WNYC as we continue with Alon Stavins, Professor of Humanities and Latin American and Latino Culture at Amherst College and author of the book, A Nation Wrestles with God, American Prophets, Philosophers, and Firebrands. I think you brought another excerpt to read. I don't know what it is. So you want to set something up and read us somebody's words?
More than another excerpt, I'd like to talk, Brian, about some of the more controversial pieces in the piece, because in a variety of forums, there has been the question of why include Alice Walker, for instance, or Donald Trump, or Woody Allen, or Cesar Chavez, now debunked as the farm workers leader, in an anthology about America. And I thought very deeply about all this when putting together the book. And to me, it is first and foremost a statement that God can be as divisive as he can be, or it can be, unifying. And many of the people that have proposed views on God have themselves ended up with questionable moral careers or decisions that they made. If I were to cleanse the dialogue that Americans make for those that have stumbled or those that are bad people, quote unquote, then I think we would end up with just two or three, and even themselves very questionably, all of us wondering if you can be fully and perfectly presented and wrestle with this large question. I think it's important to hear the voices of those that are pushing us to question the periphery, the parameters, the essence of God, and how they used it and abused it. And certainly in America today, from the government down, people use God to alienate and to censor and to violently go against groups that they deem to be unwelcome, transgender, gays, immigrants right now, because they are undermining our society and they are barbaric and primitive. It all comes down to seeing them as not praying to our higher spirit, the one we chose or chose us.
So, cue Donald Trump, which I think you just did. And for a little bit of context, you recognize in the book, I see that President Trump obviously is not known for his spirituality, while there's this irony of his political base being dominated or led or inspiring the most faith, if we can use that word, by white evangelical Protestants. Now, recently, Trump came back to invoking God as he accused communists of being godless. Listeners might recall he also recently used this term to describe New York's Democratic Socialist mayors, Zohran Mamdani. But here he is the other day speaking in honor of America's 250th anniversary.
The godless communist morality states that anything is justified to bring about inhuman visions and to really propose what's good. They don't want good. They don't love God, and they don't want God. They don't love religion, and they don't want religion, and they won't have it. But we will not let them win.
You want to put that rhetoric in context?
I would love to put it in context, but I have to contain my own discomfort and anger, I have to say. This is the ultimate transactional politician. He is not a believer in anything but making money. And in whatever way that fortune can be built, he is ready to bow down to idols and gods, no matter where they come from. This is a man who has known very well throughout his political career how to manipulate the evangelical Christians, or how to use terms of like anti-Semitism for his own purposes. I find it absolutely ironic and distressing, Brian, that a man who has done much evil in terms of abusing others, women in particular, can talk about a godless entity that are the communists or those that he doesn't sympathize with. But hey, this is American politics, and an American politician will go before their audience and say whatever this politician thinks that audience will want at that particular moment. And very few are as savvy, as rhetorically engaging to their type of followers as Trump is. So a godless president who talks about God in order to alienate those that he dislikes, very American.
Have you ever looked at the Soviet Union? And to be clear, not to conflate American democratic socialists today with, Soviet communists of yore. But have you ever looked at the Soviet Union in the context of your interest in religion and culture? And what was an explicit attempt to outlaw religion, right?
Absolutely. And this is probably one of the most interesting experiments, not only in terms of labor and economy, but in terms of spirituality. From the very beginning, with a Marxist Leninist view, the Soviet Union tried to outlaw and eradicate any idea that would come close to an institutional religion, only to find decade after decade that people spontaneously went for it privately in the comfort of their homes, and that by the time in 89 the Berlin Wall came down, many people immediately returned to something that had been prohibited in the country. The same thing happened in Cuba. Fidel Castro at the very beginning was adamantly against every single religion, including voodoo and Afro-Cuban religions, only to find out that the only way that he could bring people together was to enable them and allow them, even though not officially from the state. And ironically, Fidel Castro ended up being quite a close friend of the Jewish community, for instance, in Havana, and allowing for the Afro-Cuban culture and religion to manifest itself, but though he saw it as folklore, not as religion.
One more text from a listener who writes, here's another quote, see if you can recognize it. I don't know if it's in the book or not. God is a concept by which we measure our pain. It's a song lyric. Do you know it?
I don't know it, but I love it.
God is a concept by which we measure our pain. John Lennon.
I love that. I love that line. Yes, it is. Why do we suffer? What is it? Is suffering a way to improving ourselves? Are we here in a battle against pain? And who sends us that pain? Then I can spend in a single day the whole gamut of religious connections. I might start my day as an atheist and end up my day as a deist or a spiritualist. I find that big question of suffering, why do people suffer, is one that will inevitably bring the masses back to a higher being.
Before you go, you are a professor of Latin American and Latino culture at Amherst College. What would you say in general terms about Latino contribution to religion in this country?
Yes. Latinos, some 60 to 65 million, are very devout and have been at all times. There has always been a solid presence of Catholicism, Christianity in Latin America, though Protestantism has made headways throughout that continent. There is an extraordinary transformation of Latinos when they come to the United States. Their Catholic, Christian, or Protestant views undergo a process of acclimation or adaptation. They become much more American. They engage with God less necessarily in an old-fashioned church-like way and more in the pop culture engagement that we have. And I think the future of religion in many ways is in the Latino community, that time after time remains solid and connected with its beliefs, even though those beliefs keep mutate in the process of becoming American.
And it's a question I've asked about the anti-immigrant push by those who, were in that camp, because they tend to be conservative. They tend to be religiously affiliated, particularly with various forms of Christianity. And yet, who's coming from south of the border? It's all these Catholics and Pentecostals.
Absolutely. And if there is anybody at this point, regardless of your or my religion, that needs to be seen as human and not only as another number, are all those immigrants that are struggling to have a better life and that have their faith as a torch that leads them, maybe by the second generation, their children become less religious. It is said that many, many Americans have lost the interest in joining a church or a mosque or a synagogue or other types of religious temples, but that spirituality is on the rise in this country and has been so for the last few decades. I think that it is the immigrant right now that is the vulnerable figure that all of us, again, regardless of which God you're praying to, need to defend and embrace. We are all immigrants. We all came as immigrants. Even those that were here are migrants. And that movement has only invigorated us. It is a shame that our government has targeted immigrants and their barbaric views as undermining the most religious concepts that Christianity, Catholicism in particular, have.
Thank you for migrating to our airwaves today. Ilan Stavins, now the author of A Nation Wrestles with God, American Prophets, Philosophers, and Firebrands. Thanks so much.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you.
And that's the Brian Lehrer Show for today. Have a great weekend, everyone. The show will be back live on Monday. Stay tuned for all of it.